Socrates' defense at his trial can also be seen as a defense of the practice of philosophy. As we've seen, he believes that it is a sacred duty which the god Apollo has enjoined him to perform. In his defense, he says, quote, "This is what the god tells me to do. Make no mistake about it. And I don't think you've ever benefited more from anything than you have from my service to the god." End quote. Since it's a divine duty, he can't simply abandon it without invoking the wrath of the god. Moreover, if he's compelled to choose, he's obliged to follow the divine command instead of that of his fellow humans, since the god's command represents a higher law. Socrates can't disobey the oracle and the divine command, for this would be sacrilegious and a denial of the gods. Somewhat oddly, Socrates invokes the Greek warrior ethic in his defense. He claims that he would be a coward to abandon his divine duty and what he inwardly knows to be correct simply because he now fears being condemned and sentenced to death. He recalls the famous passage from the Iliad when Achilles decides to avenge the death of his friend Patroclus, even though he's told that by doing so he will cause his own death. He thus implicitly compares himself with Achilles, the prototypical Greek warrior and the very embodiment of the warrior ethic. This comparison is followed up by an indirect reminder to the jury that Socrates himself served as a soldier in the Peloponnesian War at Potidaea, Amphipolis, and Delium. It will be recalled that in the Gorgias, Callicles claimed that philosophy was useful in small doses, but when one grew older, one should abandon it. He does not see in philosophy anything of deeper value. Socrates now claims his life of philosophy by claiming, quote, "It's actually the greatest good for a human being to get into discussion every day about goodness and the other subjects you hear me talking and examining myself and others about, and that for a human being, a life without examination is actually not worth living." According to Socrates, reflection in philosophical thought is the highest human activity. Why was this such a threat to the Athenians? Most people are busy with the affairs of daily life and don't spend much time on philosophical reflection. They simply go about their business and tend not to worry about the kinds of abstract questions that Socrates is concerned with. Socrates would say that they are living unreflective lives. These people rely on custom and tradition for their answers. Instead of trying to embark upon the arduous road of determining the truth for themselves, they simply accept the ideas that they have been taught by their family from their childhood and leave it at that. The strength of custom and tradition is great in our modern world, but it was even greater for the ancient Greeks. They had great reverence for their ancestors and for the old traditions that had been handed down through the generations. This complex constellation of beliefs, customs, laws, and ethical conceptions was the backbone of Greek society. By raising critical questions, Socrates invariably brought into question some of the sacred values and traditions of the Greeks. This was perceived as a great threat to many conservatives in Athens. Even today, some people reject engaging in philosophical speculation on certain topics since they fear it might act as a kind of poison and undermine their established belief system. If one does this too much, then the result might well be that one erodes the foundation of everything, with the result that, in the end, it would be impossible to believe in anything anymore. To this way of thinking, philosophical reflection is potentially dangerous and should be minimized or, even better, avoided altogether. This is also related to the charge that Socrates was corrupting the youth of Athens. What does this amount to? Older people tend to be more set in their ways. They have lived long lives in accordance with accepted custom and tradition. Young people, however, are more malleable. They're more prone to experiment with new ideas or to reject older ones that seem unfair, unreasonable, or simply useless to them. When the young men of Athens saw Socrates questioning people and exposing their ignorance on topics that these people claimed to know something about, this was an amusing spectacle. Each time they saw a somewhat arrogant older person humbled by Socrates, this eroded their confidence in the claims of that person. When they saw this happening again and again, it created the impression that nothing that the older generation said should be given much credence, since these older people are not reflective and are simply repeating old ideas and cliches that they've heard. This then, over time, can induce young people to become increasingly critical and hostile to older beliefs and customs. Once this begins to happen and a general wave of skepticism arises, then the old beliefs of Athens are under threat. This was of grave concern to many of Socrates' contemporaries who perceived this new way of thinking as the signal of the imminent collapse of their traditional way of life. It will be recalled that at the trial, an attempt was made to associate Socrates with the early scientists who denied the divinity of the heavenly bodies. The new ideas which marked the beginning of scientific thinking, while exciting to some, were threatening to many. One of Socrates' accusers, Anytus, had a son whom he claimed Socrates had corrupted. Anytus had a business of a tanner and had trained his son in this business. It was customary in Greek life for fathers to train their sons to continue in the family profession. However, after associating with Socrates, Anytus' son lost his desire to be a tanner and wanted to do something else with his life. From our modern perspective, there would be nothing particularly wrong about this, since we believe that each individual has the right to choose his or her own profession. But in the world of ancient Greece, this was not the case. Ancient custom and tradition dictated that one follow in the footsteps of one's father and that one obey the father's commands. This was thought to be the natural order of things. Socrates is said to have corrupted Anytus' son by undermining the latter's belief in these traditions and making him indifferent to the wishes of his father. While the story of Anytus and his son appears more clearly in Xenophon's account of Socrates' defense than in Plato's, one can catch a glimpse of the kind of thing that Anytus is worried about here as well. Socrates addresses the jurors as follows, quote, "Best of men, I ask you this, aren't you ashamed of caring about acquiring the greatest possible amount of money together with reputation and honors, while not caring about even sparing a thought for wisdom and truth and making your soul as good as possible?" End quote. This can certainly be interpreted to mean that Socrates thinks that people should leave off pursuing their commercial and business pursuits for the sake of philosophical contemplation. For the young people of Athens, it was presumably more interesting to hang out with Socrates and listen to him humiliate self-satisfied people than to earn a living at some boring profession that they had seen their fathers practice without joy for many years. This was a very serious issue in Greek life. By teaching young people to be critical and to think for themselves, Socrates was effectively undermining some of the fundamental values and traditions of ancient Athenian society. Thus, philosophy appears not to be a neutral scholarly undertaking aimed at attaining new knowledge, but instead a nefarious, cancerous growth that, if given free rein, will undermine traditional Athenian life completely.